We're focused on culturally relevant pedagogy within our practices and how who we are informs how we teach for today's session. So, for today's presenters, I would like to turn it on. First, we have Dr. James Holly Jr. Second, second we have Dr. Yvette Hera, Dr. Homero Merce, and then Dr. Brooke Coley. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Holly Jr. can share his screens and start the presentation. So thank you again for being with us all today, and I turn it over to you to share your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you. I'll take that baton. Neat showing her screen. Thank you, Neat. And hello, everyone. So glad that you're here. I think they said we had about 50 people register and typically half show up, and we're over that. So I don't know why you're here, who brought you here, what for, but we're glad that you're with us this afternoon. And I'm super hyped because I just had my last class for the semester. So let's do this. It's Friday. So we can, next slide, let's jump right into it. So I want to start off giving an overview of culturally relevant pedagogy. There are a lot of different pedagogies that talk about culture that are out there and some misunderstandings about various ones. You can go to the next slide. And where I wanted to start here is to articulate that culturally relevant pedagogy is a research-based theoretical model or framework. Oftentimes, the academy talks about research informed or those type of dynamics. And so I just want to say that there was a study that Dr. Gloria Lassen Billings conducted focusing on teachers who had demonstrated success with Black students. And you can read the paper to talk about how she defines success. But one thing I want to highlight is that these teachers were not all Black. So the students, the measure of success was based on their engagement with K-12 Black students, but the teachers themselves were not. And so part of that is relevant to the topic of today. Like, it's not about what culture you have, that you have to have a certain culture, I should say, or you need to have a certain identity, but it's rather naming what you bring and contribute, how that informs how you teach. And so what she examined about those teachers were, what was their background? And she says her background, because they're all women, their philosophy of teaching, their ideas about curriculum, their classroom management, and also parent and community involvement. So if you take out parent and community involvement, those are the core of what we're looking at. How does that relate to engineering classroom at the collegiate level? So there are some limitations, again, because this is looking at Black students at the K-12 level. But what we're trying to get you all to think about is how these dynamics influence our instructional practices and how can we leverage this philosophy. So can you go to the next slide, please? So at its core, there's three tenets to culturally relevant pedagogy. Student achievement, which is really the idea of aspiring that students can ask critical questions. Students can demonstrate and articulate their understanding of content. Students can read and write in various ways to show what they know. The assumptions that we all desire for students to learn, but how we express that can often be different. And so a lot of times a student's cultural, how a student shows up in the classroom, we may not express that we don't believe that they can learn, that they can achieve at similar levels to other students, but how we interact with them may indicate that we are worried about their ability to perform. And so it's about believing that all students can perform at a high level, but also allowing students to show up in their own way. So culture can be how they speak, it can be how they dress, how they orient themselves in the classroom, just allowing students to show up as themselves. And then cultural critique, which is over time transform into socio-political consciousness or critical consciousness in terms of her framing. Dr. Lassen business framing is really just about critiquing social inequities, like naming what social inequities exist that influence the educational process, but also it forms or influences the way the students live experiences outside the classroom. So how is that being connected to the content in which you're teaching? These three are not about picking one and saying like, oh, I like this one, I like that one. Culturally relevant pedagogy requires that you use all of them and interchange, like working together. That is what actually informs. So if you emphasize culture, or if you emphasize student achievement, that's good, but she's asking or encouraging us to think about how they relate to one another. Typically, you can go to the next slide. What I do is, in talking about CRP, is walking through the tenets, but and revisiting her original paper, what I felt would be more helpful for this discussion, you can go to the next one, is looking at what ideologies and beliefs teachers had that informed their dynamic in the classroom. So a lot of times faculty may be like, hey, I'm teaching engineering. Like, I don't know every student's culture. I have 200 students, or I don't know how to bring in cultural context to the classroom. And so these three underlying beliefs, I think, help us give a starting point to think about how do we become culturally relevant instructors. And so once he talks about conceptions of self and others that these teachers had. And so I highlight some of the bullet points, but one is believing that all students are capable of academic success. I said that already, right? But the other is seeing the pedagogy as art. So not always defined. Typically, like someone in my position who's on a tenure track, it's typical that you're like, I want to establish this class, get it set, so I don't have to touch it anymore. So I have to think about when I go into the classroom, spending time on teaching or preparing and things like that. And what she is saying that you may have certain models that you use, certain content you go to, but realizing that in the classroom is a dynamic interaction between human beings. And so being open to being flexible with what you're teaching, how you're teaching, what unanticipated aspects may show up in the classroom, right? But there's also this part of pulling knowledge out. So and rather than seeing students like we're trying to invest in them, like give them knowledge that they don't have, seeing the education, the pedagogical practice as seeing what students already know. How can we connect to information and experiences that they already have so that they then deepen their understanding of the contents that we're trying to, the concepts we're trying to present. The next, you can go to the next one. The next underlying principle is around social relations. And so this is about student-teacher dynamics in the classroom, right? And so we recognize in the engineering courses, it's very common to have large classrooms. So this does not necessarily mean that every individual student, you have a certain way of interacting with every individual in your classroom, but that you make space to have healthy interactions with students, that you disrupt this hierarchical arrangement between student and teachers where not that we're necessarily saying students can come to the classroom and say what they want or do what they want, but we are bringing ourselves down to earth to recognize that one, again, we're all human beings, but just as much as we have something to contribute to the class and learning, students have something as well, right? Making space for student inquiry, making space for students that have challenges that they can communicate those challenges, making space for students to seek help if they need help, that we encourage help-seeking behaviors rather than having an antagonistic relationship between ourselves and students where we're seen as the enemy, and also helping students in their relation to one another. So often in engineering departments, it's common that there's a culture of competition. So students may not want to work with one another because my grade is depending on me doing better than you, as opposed to me having a heavy grasp of content. So disrupting those cultures so that we help students to see one another as resources, seeing each other as stronger in one area than another, that they can build on each other's knowledge. And then another dynamic, you go to the next slide, that these teachers share was conceptions of knowledge. Now I'm going to highlight one here, but this idea that assessment must be multifaceted. Right. So if we want to know what students know, we need to provide multiple forms of expression for students to demonstrate what they know. Timed exams may be helpful for some people who've been trained in that method of articulating their knowledge in a very particular way, but it's a limited range of assessment. And so this is not necessarily about critiquing traditional forms of assessment, but rather exposing the limitations of those forms of assessment and choosing other ones that can highlight other skill sets that students have. So having diverse forms of assessment allow us to get a better, more accurate representation. So it's not about, the Black students like to talk a lot, so let me do something that they can then see, they can see as being seen as smart in the classroom, but it's rather to say, how can I accurately know what the students know? And so having diverse forms of assessment allow us to do that. So those are some quick points. Happy to answer questions in the chat or later, but that's my piece.
Thanks, James. Kind of following up from what the lovely introduction that James gave us about CRP, we thought that would be good to maybe early on in the workshop, do some interactive work. So for our first interactive, we want to focus on uncomfortable situations, experiences in the classroom, not necessarily always uncomfortable situations as an instructor. Could be an uncomfortable situation as a student. It could be an uncomfortable situation as someone who's helping out in a classroom, or you could have a sibling, a child who could have had an uncomfortable situation. So we'll break this up in groups after we do a little bit of an individual reflection. So I know this is usually the time in workshops where people will either turn their video off or leave because we're going to put people in breakout groups. But I'd like to tell you that after we're done with this activity, we'll come back to sharing some more content. So I'd request for you to stay on this lovely Friday afternoon. At least it is in Boston. So so individually, if folks could maybe take a minute, 2 minutes, and reflect on this question about think about one of your worst or most uncomfortable classroom experiences. And the first one that comes to mind is fine. Every time I think of this, I come up with a new experience. And if folks feel comfortable with it, and you could share that in the chat, that'd be great. But it's also okay if you don't want to put it in the chat. We'll have some time to share in smaller breakout groups. So the question is, think about one of your worst or most uncomfortable classroom experiences as an educator, as a student, as an onlooker, anything. And if you feel comfortable, please put it in the chat. Okay, does anybody want to go first? I guess I'm just seeing other chats here. Anyone want to share an uncomfortable experience? Okay, we have something from Katie. As folks are reflecting on that, let me add a question to that. Is as you think about this uncomfortable experience, you're probably automatically thinking about what made this experience uncomfortable.
So we got a lot popping up in the chat, Abney.
Yeah.
Do you want to read some of these out? Can we?
Yep.
Or
Yep.
share
I
some?
just pulled up the chat. We can read. We probably have a couple of minutes, so we can do that. So there's a lot of interesting things around gender. So let's see. So Katie shared, "Are you lazy or just plain stupid?" It's pretty awesome that those are the two options, right? I had, let's see, I had to prove with the dictionary the concept I was presenting in class because a small group of students did not agree with me. That's really interesting. That's happened. In fact, interesting, that's happened to me while I worked in the engineering industry. My most uncomfortable experience is when I was asked to do a family tree. Guess another one related from Moses. As a student, I once asked my teacher if she had found her father. The statement that warranted the question was, "I lost my father over the weekend." He wasn't trying to be funny, he just completely missed the meaning. So that's an interesting one on language. Megan shared about what would a girl know anything about XXS while working on a master's in engineering course. The more things around language. Being asked to critique, that's a big one, how graduate students are not often considered as fellow scholars, entering education academy at large, being misunderstood. Interesting. I use the male, Roel is sharing, I use the male pronoun for a student based on an educated guess. The student called me on it that they wanted to be referred to as gender neutral way. Roel felt uncomfortable and viewed it as a teachable moment. And then someone being told that they're pretending to hear when they're actually hearing impaired. So lots of interesting things here. We see a lot of different types of kind of different types of background, different types of reasons for why these would be uncomfortable. A lot of times it's the teacher is not necessarily thinking about where the students are coming from. I also saw some here where the student does not necessarily understanding where their classmates are coming from, which is another place. So as you kind of go into that, kind of looking at time here, what I'd request Christina to maybe put folks in groups of 4, and we'll put this in the broadcast chat as well, but in groups of 4. The first question, if everybody could go around and answer the question that we asked earlier individually. So what is your uncomfortable moment? Please make sure that everyone gets a chance to share. So go around in groups of 4 and share that. And then if you have time after that, as a group collectively, think about and talk about if there are similarities or contrasts in your shared experiences and what might have gone unnoticed in your classrooms during these experiences. So we'll put all of this text in the broadcast chat as well as we move into breakout groups. But remember, let's make sure that everyone gets a chance to at least share, if they want to, their uncomfortable experience. And if I could request one person in every group to be the note taker, if you could make note on what are these similarities and contrasts, and when we come back to the main group here, we'll request you to put that in the Zoom chat so that other people can see what was shared in other breakout groups. Of course, if possible, it'd be great if you don't bring in identifiable information as you come back and share what's happening in the rooms. Great, Christina, whenever you're ready. That was funny. For a second, I only saw 7 people come back, and then I was like, "Oh, I guess we lost everybody else." But then everyone else popped back up as well. So that was nice. Folks who were note takers for each of the rooms, if you remembered to do that, it's okay if you didn't. Could we start hearing what was discussed in the rooms in the chat, please? If you could copy paste your discussion notes in chat, and we actually even have time to hear verbally from a few rooms. So whoever wants to share first, please raise your hand. You can raise your hand in Zoom using reactions if you haven't done that before. Okay, we're seeing some folks put things in the chat. Anybody who wants to share verbally what was discussed in the room? Or maybe I should say, who wants to go first? So I have to tell everyone that we did a version of this workshop at the Reese conference, and we had some folks from South Africa and Australia joining us, and they were literally fighting for the mic. And this is really interesting that the ASCE members don't want to share. Maybe it's just the fact that it's maybe Friday afternoon for many people. But if folks aren't comfortable sharing verbally, I can just read some of the chats here. Let's see. So we have some report out from Cynthia's groups. There are similarities around the experiences that took place in academic classrooms, facilitating discussion with students of different backgrounds and diversity and privilege. And the contrasts were different ways that the students reacted and different levels of comfort and discomfort. Let's see. Adam's group, their report outs are they only thought from teacher perspective, a bit privileged, not thinking of student discomfort. Language can complicate comfort. Interesting. The lost parent example that Moses has shared earlier, giving extra time in exams, students with needs. I'm actually really curious about the report out from Cynthia's group, in which they talked about contrast in the way that students reacted and different levels of comfort or discomfort. So if Cynthia or someone from that group would mind sharing, maybe unmute yourself, go right ahead. What were the different reactions and levels of comfort?
I guess I can go ahead.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Cynthia.
I'll just
Yes.
offer a chance to the other groups. Okay, so the example that comes to mind most is one where it was an entrepreneurship class, and it was mostly, oh, no, that's the wrong class. But actually, it was a situation where some of the students felt like the classroom makeup was highly diverse, and yet other students coming from a different background challenged that and said, how can you say that? And then the response was, well, if you came from where I'm coming from, you would consider this diverse. But the bottom line was that some of the students really felt after the conversation went around that they weren't able to fully express their voice in the conversation.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we have that's interesting. So Samantha just shared from her group something that I just did with Cynthia, the unnecessary singling out of individuals or group of individuals, and being ignorant of individuals' personal experiences and blind to the possibility of their lived experiences. And this is, I mean, this stuff is, it's hard to do when you're teaching a big classroom, right? And I know Homero has some really great material after this about why it's still important to do the work. And so I wouldn't go too much in there, but I think there should perhaps be a recognition of the fact that what we all do is hard enough. And then to further do the right thing, it requires even more work. There's some more sharing around there are similarities of power imbalances in the fact that there is dominant and marginalized groups between students and professors. Fagners group shared bad experiences, which is so powerful, and it's good that we were able to find an opportunity to share bad experiences. Katie's group, some similarities are around white man's words, power differential, and the way people treated other students. I think we've gotten a report out from several of the groups. Anything? Yep, James, go ahead.
So I feel like most of the responses are heavy on the similarities and differences. I'm curious people's thoughts on what went unnoticed. Mm-hmm. Right? So, we think about these experiences and they're happening in an academic setting. I'm curious if, just, I don't know how much time we got left in this section, but one or two folks, if you could share like what went unnoticed in the classroom during these moments.
Yeah, feel free to put it in chat if you don't want to unmute yourself, but that's definitely.
Like Adam.
Yeah, Adam,
one of our breakout room members mentioned that with an instructor that they had, that the instructor would call on the student, would say the student's name first and then ask the question, right, but in front of the whole class. And by doing that, saying the student's name first, everything sort of became a wash after that, of mix of anxiety, panic, or whatnot, and thinking about how to process that. And I remember as a younger instructor doing that same thing before I learned from someone older and wiser that they said that I should swap that order. Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine how many times I did that myself.
Gretel, go ahead.
And that makes me think about another example that emerged in our group about a co-faculty member teaching a course who was clearly, she may have been a majority member, and she was doing her own homework and becoming more educated about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the way she was expressing her new knowledge ended up marginalizing people. It made them feel incredibly comfortable. It was sort of these global statements about majority people do this, and people who are people of color or people who are international who may not know majority English language in an American institution may not be able to write as proficiently or whatever. So the intention was to sort of highlight her awareness about diversity, different, I don't know, awarenesses and privileges and challenges, and yet the way that it was being done undermined the whole process, and instead of fostering belonging, I actually cemented a sense of alienation and exclusion. And I know, I don't believe I've been in that position myself, but I can imagine that as I've tried to learn more and become more sophisticated about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's been places that I've been awkward and not as skilled as I would have liked to have been. And I just wonder, you know, how you become proficient is by trying, and yet your trial could inadvertently undermine the very thing you're trying to do. So just put that out there as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Gretel. Yeah.
We talk about impact and intent, and we live in a very critical space, and so at the same time as we may be well intentioned, it's hard to create safe spaces to try without, so that we can minimize the impact of awkward action.
Yeah, no, thanks really for sharing that. I mean, it's part of the reason why we, at least I can speak for myself, CRP is really interesting, because it gives us as educators a chance to examine who we are and how that impacts how we do things, as opposed to there being a blanket, you know, this is the way to do it. I know we had a comment from Fagner, if you want to share, and then we can apologize if I mispronounce your name there.
No problem, no problem. I'm from Brazil, okay, so it's gonna be very difficult to express myself in English, but I'm trying. Professor Adam to bring me some memories about the situation I had in class as a professor. But I have to make the context here first. You know, in Brazil, soccer is very common, it's very popular, and I'm not a good player. Okay, so it's very useful to, it's very common to have at the time of choosing players of each team, you're gonna, two of the guys is gonna choose, I pick the number A, letter A, I pick C, and I pick B, and so on. So I was the last one, of course, because I don't know how to play soccer. I'm the goalkeeper. Okay, that's the last position. And once I did this in class in order to separate into 4 groups. And I picked 4 students randomly. And I said, go on, you choose one, you choose 2, you choose another one, you choose another one. And in the beginning, it was very okay, because they were choosing the guys who are more connected to them. But at the end, the last ones were like, nobody chose me. Okay, can you understand what I said? So it was the first and the last time I did that. I've never done that again, because of this feeling I felt from them. That's the share and the experience I would like to share.
Yeah, that's super powerful. Thanks so much for sharing. We'll have some more time to do some discussions and do some collective sharing out as well. For now, I'd hand it over to Homero as I share my screen again. It's going to talk to us about some experiences and examples, of CRP.
Thank you, and great conversations, everyone. I'm sorry that some of my I know people in the room have seen some of my examples already, so sorry for doing this again, but I think those examples really bring the conversation to the point where I want the conversation. So I always start, can we go to the next slide, I think. So can we, I always try to start this framing with a story about myself, but also it's a great joke that I also tell. And some of you are looking at me and say, no, it's not a good joke, and that's true. But anyway, let's do the experiment. You can use the chat or you can unmute yourself, however you feel better, but and knock, knock.
Who's there?
Broken pencil.
Broken pencil who?
Never mind, it's pointless. All right. Please don't force me to leave the room. I want to hang out with you all. I always tell this story because this is something that happened to me when I moved to the US from Venezuela. I'm originally from Venezuela. I moved 10 years ago to the US, and my son was 3 years old. And he started doing, I don't know, pre-K, kindergarten, whatever it is, what they do at that age, that I'm always confused about the names. And he came home one day and he's really excited. He's waiting for me to come back from the university. And he's really, really excited because he wants to tell me that he learned his first joke. So I come home and of course I'm excited. And he comes to me and said, "Dad, knock, knock." And I look at him and I say, "Oh, that's funny." And he starts crying and he goes to his room. And I'm like, what in the world just happened? And he's in crisis, right? And he's crying and then my wife comes and says, "Oh, you were supposed to say who's there." And I said, "Well, how can I know these things? I mean, I've been living in Venezuela for 32 years. That's not humor to me. I cannot make sense of these jokes. So call him back, please." And he comes back and I said, "Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Can you tell me the joke again?" "Yes, sure. Knock, knock. Who's there?" "Broken pencil." And I say, "Oh, that's so funny." And he lost it, of course. He goes to his room. Was it too difficult to tell me that there was a second part of this whole complicated process that I don't understand, right? And I always use this example because one of the things that I learned from that and that I keep going back to that whenever we have conversations about these issues is that I love my kid. I don't want to hurt my kid. That doesn't mean that my position of ignorance is more important than his position of pain. That doesn't mean that I can justify what is happening pretending to ignore his pain and just saving myself from the whole situation, saying, "I didn't know, no one told me. You know, I'm new to this country. Sorry." No, that's not how it works. And I think it's also really important to think, and we were having conversations in our breakout rooms about terrible experiences in the classroom. And how many times our terrible experiences come from we bringing knock-knock jokes into the classroom, assuming everyone will know what to say next. Because yes, maybe 80% of the people know what to say next. But what's happening with that 20%? We're losing them. And usually those are the ones that want to engage more. So I think whenever I think about this, about the space and about what culturally relevant pedagogy is, and I want to connect back with some of the discussion, but also with James' great points at the beginning, is the things that we do and the intentionality that we bring, right? So when I start talking about examples and when I start thinking about what we can actually do in the classroom, because that's what people keep telling me, okay, yeah, but how? What? Tell me how to do it in the classroom. I know it works. I know it's great. I don't know what else to do. What's next? Or some people will push back and say, yeah, but are you telling me I need to learn all the cultures that I have in the classroom? And I need to be proficient in all the different identities and ways that people bring? And no, of course not. That's not what it is. What it is being willing to invest, being willing to get to know. And if we go to next slide, I think that's what I have in the next slide, and on how do we do it, right? I think one of the most important things is having a willingness to know your students. And there are different ways that you can do that. It can be by pre-semester surveys, which is one of the most effective things that I think I do. And I ask them a bunch of things. I ask them, where are you from? And I leave it open so they can tell me whatever they want. I ask them about, favorite song. I ask them about things related to the class. I ask them about anything they want to share. I mean, I try to bring a lot of information and start making a sense of who they are. Of course, that's difficult when you have 500 students in a statics class, but still, there are things that you can do. There are things that you can learn from your students. You can learn from what students are saying. You can learn also from what students are not saying. You can learn from the type of questions that they are asking. You can learn from the way that they come into the classroom and that they present to you and the information that they share and what they bring physically or else. So I think taking the time for that investment is really important. And then trying to incorporate some of those experiences to make sure and being intentional about your experiences or the things that you're showing not being from only one perspective. Because I think that's what creates, because for me, it's a lot about setting the tone and setting the environment. If we are able to push an environment where people feel valued and people feel free to bring their experiences and people feel free to share and ask questions, that's when engagement happens. And that's when all these relationships start becoming very effective. And that, if we go back to learning theories, that's what leads to learning. Not only for the students that have been traditionally marginalized, but learning for everyone, like James said. Right, this has been proven to bring academic excellence into our classroom. So one thing that I found really powerful is asking them their favorite song and have a playlist with all their favorite songs and play it before class every single time. It's amazing how it changed the tone, the energy, and the approach that they bring into the class. And this is something really simple. And we are learning from each other, one learning from different cultures, we are learning from different backgrounds, and these things are being valued. The other thing that I made a quick note just a moment ago, in terms of the discussion around assessment, that I think is really crucial. And I think one way that we can be culturally relevant in our classrooms is by allowing first drafts. The anxiety that a lot of students bring into different classes because they don't know who you are and they don't know how you grade and they don't know what you are expecting. And even you can say 1,000 times your expectations. You can use 100 rubrics. You can repeat this over and over and over. It's not the same as when you receive feedback and you are allowed to send something and then get it back and then understand that process, right? And hopefully that process is not a graded process. Hopefully that process is a process where they are able to experiment. And then some people will say, yeah, but we don't have a space in the curriculum to do this, and we have all these students. And that's when sometimes what I've done in the past, and I shouldn't be saying this, but anyway, I give everyone the 100 and go through the process. And I let them know intentionally, everyone gets 100 in the first submission. Because for me, it's not about the grade. For me, it's about how they engage with the process of learning. Because I know down the road, they will become better learners. They will be more confident. They will have a lot of more tools that will change the tone of my class. And that's what I want. Then providing meaningful feedback. But also one thing is being really careful with the language that we use, the examples that we provide, and really thinking, where are these examples coming from? Where are our jokes coming from? Where are the things that we say coming from? And are we completely sure that everyone is getting the same information when we use them? It's a little bit of self-reflection, which brings me to my next point of, it requires also for us to check ourselves, check our own biases, check our preconceptions. We all have them, nothing wrong with having them, but we need to check them and understand and realize where they are. And that's not a process that you do one time and yeah, I know who I am and that's it. No, like James says, pedagogy is art, right? And this is a dynamic process. This is continuous reflection and continuous improvement. And the way we thought 2 years ago before this COVID thing is very different to the way we think right now. Let me show you one specific example that I found really powerful. And can we go to the next slide? So to give you context, this is in a first-year engineering class. We have a first-year engineering program and students need to take a class that is Foundations of Engineering 1 and Foundations of Engineering 2. And Foundations of Engineering 2 happens in the spring and is in the context of students designing something. So in this class, I do this little exercise in one of my sessions that keeps getting better and better as I do it. I told them, okay, you are experts in design, you are a design team, you're my engineering design team. I want to improve a product. This product is the leader in the United States. This product is fantastic. Our company does this product. And then now I want to be the leader in North America, meaning that I want to expand to Canada and Mexico. But before deploying, I want the teams to do one change and one change only, or one improvement. I think that's what I say, to this product. And then I show them the product. If you go to the next slide, this is the product. Something that they use to, especially kids will use to drink, to reach the sink and drink water. Very simple product. So some teams will jump right into solving the problem. Some more reflective team will start asking me questions. How much it costs? What's made? What's the material? Say plastic, and they ask a couple of questions. So what do you think are the improvements that this product, that the students suggest to do in this product? Any ideas? So what will you change? Let me change that. What will you do before deploying to 2 new countries? Pilot tested, local market research, how it fits, ask people of the country that what they like, saying what the whole is. All right. So things like water quality, I think you're too advanced for this class. I'm gonna place you in the master class. So usually, let me tell you what happened, because I think that's where the power is. Usually students will focus on materials. Most of them, they will focus on the materials. Some of them will focus on the aspect of the product. And let's change color. Let's make an animal like a turtle, or I don't know. They create things. What happens most of the time when we have international students in the teams is that they will go to water quality, like Nadia said. And I find that really interesting. And one of my favorite, and what I find interesting is that this opens the door for a really interesting conversation around cultural differences, but also one of my favorite ones is when one team said, we will include a filter on the product to make sure it's safe. And then I had this student from Ecuador, and she raised her hand and said, no, I don't think we should sell the product in Mexico. And I said, okay, tell me more. And she said, well, even with a filter, we will be teaching the kids that it's okay to drink water from the sink, and we're creating this culture. And then they might go to a different house where the product is not there, and they will be drinking water they're not supposed to be drinking. And that opened the door for, again, a lot of conversations about perceptions of different countries. And right there, we are developing social technical thinking and opening the conversations of social technical skills, something that is so difficult for us to bring into our engineering curriculum, right? But then one thing that really impacted me was, if we click next, this student, after this class, told me, this was the first time my teammates realized I could bring something to the table. They realized my views were also important, and I felt for the first time, after being almost 1 year at Virginia Tech, for the first time, she felt recognized as a student. And I think that is something that we really need to think about, because it happens that this example is taking us there, but I really worry about all the other students that are not feeling validated as students. And all those students that come into a classroom, and these same students one time, we keep having conversations because she's really amazing. She told me one of the most uncomfortable moments was when she came into a class and the professor was using football examples, American football examples. And she's like, I have no idea what's going on. And he kept asking questions and pushing. And she tried to say multiple times, I don't understand the sport. And he tried to even make jokes. So I think there are a lot of complexities here that we really need to pay attention to and recognize. But again, I wanna close my comments and my portion with something that James mentioned, and I really wanna emphasize. When we start creating these environments, that value diverse views and that value you bringing your cultural knowledge and your fonts of knowledge, this is beneficial for all students, not only the students which voices have been shut down for years. Everyone learned from this. Everyone achieved academic success. And the last example that I want to share is I had this student in again, first year engineering program. The first day of class, I told the students, you can call me however you want. You feel comfortable with Homero or Dr. Mursi or professor, however you want, feel free to do it. And I had this student raise his hand and he said that I was disrespectful. So, okay, tell me more. And he said, well, the engineering profession is, I don't know what he said, something that we need to respect, and I don't even remember. So I feel like we should call you Dr. Mursi because that's how we learn how to be respectful. I don't know. So I said, well, I mean, if you feel comfortable telling me Dr. Mursi, please do. Everyone else, you can tell me however you want. And, you know, he was very serious. And during the class, he kept pushing back to a lot of, I mean, we obviously had very different views, very, very different views. And I think I was able to manage some difficult conversations with him in the classroom. And I kept pushing him to think and reflect where those conceptions were coming from. And I felt like many times during that process of reflecting, he had those moments of, oh, well, maybe. So he was really reflecting, and I felt like he was moving forward in something that, in a space that he never explored before. And then my surprise was we have this program called Tenka Teacher Program that the students can send notes. And I almost fell off my chair when I saw a note from him at the end of the semester. And something that he said, I really want to emphasize. He said, thank you for being an amazing first year engineering teacher, Homero. And that was like, wow. All right. And then your professionalism and the mutual respect you have for your student goes a long way. And I think that is really important, because when you are invested and when you're showing that you care and what you are valuing students to bring their full selves and their background and be open about who they are, they perceive that as a relationship of mutual respect. And that leads to engagement. And that for sure leads to learning. Brooke, over to you.
All right, I'm coming up on the rear here. So what I'm learning is we definitely need to make this a 2-hour workshop because we have so much richness in here and we want to make sure we can get it all to you. So this part, we're transitioning in to think about the part of the equation that is most necessary, you, right? So where do we fit into this? And how do our experiences, our preparation, our awareness impact our ability to translate these things, these approaches into our classroom? So before moving to the next slide, I'd like to pose a question. And this kind of came up based on a lot of the conversation and things that have already been said. And that was, we had a lot of faculty. When Christina did the poll in the beginning, a large percentage of the group were faculty members. And so if we're in engineering classrooms, think about this question, and then we'll move on. So if your students were interviewed right now, today, if your students were interviewed in your engineering courses, what would they communicate to be what you value as reflected through your teaching? So just sit with that for a second. If your students were asked to, or were interviewed randomly, what would they communicate that you value as reflected through your teaching? Okay, so this part of the session is going to talk about the socio-political considerations of your own classroom. And in order to really situate that, we have to think about our own identity and where that identity enters the classroom, how it enters the classroom, how it influences our expectations, thoughts, perceptions, awareness of the students in our classroom, how we formulate our pedagogies, how we pick our projects, how we assess the projects. All of this is impacted by who we are. So let's go to the next slide. We've talked a lot about how different identity can show up in the classroom. This is not ours. This is just a very commonly used resource now. It's a wheel of power and privilege. And as you look at the image, centered is where the power is, essentially. And this is across the board, but we can think about this in terms of engineering as well. And as you move out to the periphery of the wheel, power diminishes, right? So those with the identities that are centered have more power. These are the identities that have been more included, more visible, more resourced, more valued in engineering, where we have, Eurocentric norms and ways of knowing and doing that have just been the status quo. And when we talk to students, a lot of students have, it's kind of sad because it's just become a common acceptance, right? This is just what it is. And many of our stories that we shared earlier reflect just that. If we think about our own identity, right? So as I go around this wheel, I'm very much on the outside of this wheel. And so when I come into my classroom, I'm very open about that. I want people to use my presence as an example so that they know they are in the room, whether they would ordinarily know that or not. So we have that ability, we have that power to impact by just our presence alone. We can give some people affirmation, we can give visibility by honing into our own identities. So what we're going to do here, and then there's one thing I wanted to point out. We have started doing some conversations with faculty that are teaching classes in engineering to see, and this goes along with the pre-survey that we sent out to you all, and hopefully you all will complete that, because this is really information that will help us sort of just get an understanding of the lay of the land, the baseline around where we are with culturally relevant pedagogy and engineering. It's a learning process. This is not to be punitive. This is just to get a sort of accurate reflection of what we know and the areas that we have to grow. And so in some of those conversations, one of the things that has come up, and we've heard it here today, are these notions of alienation, exclusion, singling out that we experience in the classroom. And the funny thing is, when we're talking to these faculty, some of what they are experiencing as barriers or maybe challenges to adopting some of these culturally relevant pedagogies is not wanting to single people out, right? So there's this conflict there that's really interesting, and we could talk more about that. To piggyback on what Homero said, I think one of the greatest advantages of culturally relevant pedagogy starts with the misconception. Culturally relevant pedagogy is not for students that have classrooms that have a large diversity of students. That's a myth, okay? It doesn't mean that you have to have a lot of Black and brown or low SES or non-able people in a classroom to think about culturally relevant pedagogy. As Homero stressed, culturally relevant pedagogy is for everyone. And it's even more critical to put it in classes where the diversity is lacking, because then that facilitates an exposure, right, to other ways of knowing, other ways of doing, cultural awareness. How are we training engineers to go into the future as culturally competent people if they never have experience doing it, if they never have experience valuing and centering other norms and cultures? So as we think, we're going to go out into breakouts in just a second, but think largely about your own identity and how that reflects or impacts the way that you show up in your classroom. And then take it a step farther and challenge yourself. Am I doing everything I could do to bring a fullness and awareness and what Homero described as a willingness, right, to embrace others so that everyone can feel visible, valued, centered in their educational pursuit. So, okay, we're going to have another interactive session, or we're going to go into breakouts. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll explain that in just a second. We're thinking about how does your identity show up in your classroom? We're thinking about how do you become aware of who your students are? Because it's more than just you, right? It's your identity, but it's also meeting your students where they are. And that poses a challenge because it's dynamic. Each semester, we're going to have a different set of bodies in those seats. And it can't be that the same thing we did for design class 3 years ago is going to work today. We've had 2 pandemics happen in there. So if you haven't changed your class at all from 2 semesters ago to now, that's an opportunity, right? Because times are dynamic. People are experiencing new things, and we should be resilient in that in our teaching and reflect that. So we're going to focus on 4 topics. These breakouts are going to be randomly generated because we don't want to have a disproportionate amount of people in the groups. And so those topics are, what might be challenges to you adopting culturally relevant pedagogy in your classroom? Maybe there are some policies at your institution. Maybe your class size is astronomical and you don't know how you could do this without some other supports. You can think about that, but you're going to go at people. There will be several groups for each of these topics because we thankfully have a very large attendance. So that's topic 1. Topic 2, your role of educator identity. So thinking about this wheel, how can, language be censored, or thinking about mental health or neurodivergency or citizenship or sexuality or race? How are these things coming to play for you and also your awareness of the students in your classroom? Omero provided fabulous examples. I always want to answer the question because I feel like now that I know, I want to answer when he gives his challenge, but those are some examples. And I saw Nadia say she's adopted in her class. From Omero, I added an extension to one of my projects and had them consider, now that you've made this design, iterate it to be applicable for another country, choosing something that they wouldn't think about. And I learned that from Omero. So even these dialogues help us to stimulate and expand upon ideas. So what are some of the examples of CRP that you may have already implemented in your classroom or that you'd like to implement? Please have that discussion in the breakout. And then the last group we're going to split into is going to discuss the benefits of CRP for engineering students. So when you think about these notions, James did a great job of telling us about, cultural competence, critical consciousness, student achievement, and these things needing to happen in parallel, not choosing one or the other, but the system of these things happening to truly advance students feeling present and anchored and valued in their engineering education. So what are some of the benefits explicitly? How do you see this being of value? How can we articulate to faculty why they should be doing this? How can we make administrators hold faculty accountable for doing this, right? And not necessarily giving options whether we do this or not, and seeing it as a necessity. So we're going to break out. You will randomly be assigned. So hopefully you're willing to contribute in whatever group you land in. And then we'll have about 8 minutes again. We'll send some prompts over to keep you on task. And then let's see, we'll have about 5 minutes maybe. So maybe let's keep the breakouts to 5 minutes so we can at least have or initiate about a 5-minute dialogue. And this is why I said we need 2 hours. So Christina, whenever you're ready, if you could send everyone into their breakouts, please.
Oh, I was about to say, did I come back too early?
Okay, so as everyone comes back, I know that was a teaser because my group, we just started warming up. So I'm assuming that's what was happening in all these breakout groups. But my mom always says leave when they're still wanting more. So that means we'll come back and have this continued dialogue, right? Great. So let's, if we can, since we had a few groups to each of the different topics, let's at least go through the topics and have maybe 1 or 2 groups just speak out or share out about what their group discussed as it related to that particular aspect. So let's start with the role of educator identity. So what were some of the points discussed or shared? Anybody care to start there? I'm not as nice as Avneet, so I'll just call names, and I don't know what you were in.
I can talk. In our group, we shared quite a different, or many different ways of like sharing aspects of your identity. Also, sort of to role model students sharing their identity. So doing things, you know, whether it's like, I don't know, a slideshow at the beginning, or the example that Homero talked about with the Spotify playlist, but things that sort of help showcase some of the diversity and give you an opportunity to share aspects of your identity that might not be visible.
I think that's really good. And sometimes too, when students see that, it's almost like permission, or it's a message in itself that this is welcome in the space. And so sometimes it doesn't have to be the explicit nature of their identity, but just that this is encouraged, and it registers that space as a space where different is accepted, welcome, shared. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that, Nadia. Did anyone else want one more group about the role of educator identity?
Just one thing, I can jump in just to answer James' question, because this came up in our group, because I mentioned the values of engineering faculty. When I'm saying values of engineering faculty, that to adopt or even to think about sort of adopting CRP is that the diversity and that we desire, that we say we desire, that has to become a value of the faculty member to even begin to think about some of these things. So Homero gave the example earlier that he doesn't necessarily care about the grade, right? He cares about the students learning. That is a value. And that's what I'm saying, is that we have to have a shift in values away from grades to actual learning, to actual growth, as opposed to a number or a letter grade, right? So when I'm saying values, I'm saying our performance metrics. How do we evaluate that a student knows whatever, right? How do we actually know that? And more importantly, how do we know they can operationalize that once they get away out of our presence, right? And that's what I mean, and I'm referring to in terms of a shift of values. So hopefully that's clear now. And yes, I will preach.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I wouldn't expect anything less. That speaks to so much, and the values are centric, and that was the original question. What would your students say are your values based on their interaction in your class? Because whether you want them to or not, they are getting a message. So what is the message that's being told, right? And that is a prompt for us to individually reflect. One other thing I'll add to that, when we think about the grades, I've actually tried to do something similar in my class, and Homero, we should talk about this offline in one of our meetings, but it's really interesting because students have been so socialized to the norms that when you try to do something where you shift the way grades are, you take grades away, they panic. They don't like it, and it's resistance, right? So that there's something there too. So how can we speak to that, and how can we help to shift or change the culture in the way that students can be free to have new experiences and not feel like now, if they don't, they're not doing engineering or something like that. So let's go to another group. What were some, well, let's say what we think is some of the benefits of CRP for engineering students. I think we've hit that, but let's just, if there are a couple different things that came out, we're happy to have you share.
I'll share from, I'm going to jump in front of the other Adam since he already
Okay, the fight of the Adams. Okay, go ahead.
In the chat, and I didn't get to talk in my group, so I'll just share what everyone was sharing in the group. Getting to know everyone on a people level, which benefits both faculty and students, and just being able to hear where people are coming from. And the other piece was putting all of this on the same level as the technical aspects of these courses, where students might view some of these conversations and topics as not as important as the technical stuff that they're getting in class. I mean, that's something I've struggled with for years, of students telling me things like communication isn't an engineering skill. I mean, come on, right? And so Adam had put in there, you know, from his group, right, to explicitly talk about DI in the classroom, but to put it on the same level. So it's important to make sure that this isn't just happening in, say, project-based courses like the one that you and I teach, Brooke, but happening in those classes like statics classes. I know I observed Nadia's class one time, and she was talking about imposter syndrome in a statics class, right? Statics and dynamics class, like what? And so, those are some of those benefits that, I think are really, really important for us to highlight in all the classes that get taught in all levels of engineering. So that's a little bit of a summary from what everyone else was sharing in my group.
Thanks for sharing that, Adam. And, it's really interesting because a lot of us already have an existing model of this that we seem to only use in that realm. And so many of us acquire funding from the National Science Foundation, right? The National Science Foundation has the model for us. There's intellectual merit, which in this place would be like the technical, and then there's broader impacts, which would be sort of like the social, the impact. No grant gets funded one without the other, right? You cannot put in you can put it in, but it probably won't get funded. And so how can we have the same type of thinking in our classrooms where the technical is just as valued as the social? So I appreciate that, Adam. We have probably time for one more question because I promised Christina that we would be on point with the time and we need to give her 2 minutes at least at the end. So challenges to CRP. We're interested. What are some of the challenges that you perceive, have experienced, or anticipate to adopting CRP in your teaching? Challenges are normally where everyone's easiest to talk, and the challenges. We can always identify challenges. Any? Fear? Okay.
Jump in for a minute.
Would you say, Dre?
I was going to say I can jump in for a minute, and our group talked about the lack of incentives. That's something that you shared. Really no incentives to implement CRP, and also this kind of resistance from like the established tenured faculty to change.
Great, thank you for that, Dre. So as you can see, we could definitely continue this dialogue, and hopefully James, Omero, Ebony, and I will facilitate that soon. If you didn't, please complete the pre-workshop survey that we sent out, or that Christina made available as you entered the workshop. We will also have a post-workshop survey. If you could fill those out for us, it would be really, really beneficial. And we just thank you for your time. Christina?
Thank you, Brooke. And thank you, everyone, for giving this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for participating today and spending your time and learning about how this affects your teaching practices, your reflective practices, and the students in your classroom, because that's really what it's all about. I just wanted to remind everyone before I let you go that this is a workshop series, and so we will continue on with this process. We have another workshop coming on that Sarah's going to jump on and tell you about in a second. But if you feel like you have some value that you want to share, that your voice needs to be heard, I encourage you to submit a proposal so that we can learn from everyone throughout this series. The link is in the chat, as well as I believe they're going to put the reflective survey in the chat as well. Sarah, if you can join us and share what our next workshop is going to be about in January.
Sure, I already added that in the chat, along with information on where you can submit a proposal or share with others. So we have another workshop coming in January, and this is on the link I put in the chat, has more information, but this is talking about specifically women in STEM and a project that is funded by NSF that started with this workshop. So it's talking about skill-based training for women in STEM and other related topics. So I'll be the host for that workshop. We'll love to see you there. Feel free to share with your colleagues, and thanks for coming today.